Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for a review of the 2009 book by Ronald C. White, A. Lincoln, a Biography. Ronald C. White Jr., Minnesota's very own, born in Minneapolis. Uh, his background, again, like many of these biographers, a history background specifically, but this time through a little bit of a different lens. White went to the Princeton Theological Seminary, got himself a Master's of Divinity there, and served as a minister for some time before making a pivot towards pursuing history full time. Received his PhD from Princeton, and kind of his focus, and I think what set him apart early on was that while White does have this theological background, and I think it's very easy for us to associate that background with someone who maybe has a bit more of a traditionalist view of historical events and that sort of thing. White seems to have very much clung on to a more progressive worldview in that time frame. Very big advocate and fan of Martin Luther King Jr. And immediately the works that he starts to publish and starts to write starting in the 70s are these pieces on how religion and racial progress are deeply tied together, which makes certainly a lot of sense, right? I mean, Dr. King, very pious and religious man, obviously. So that becomes the focus of White's research for and a lot of his writing. Now, in the kind of in the last like 20 to 25 years or so, you start to see White focusing his historical research more on the Civil War era. And that is where we know him from today. Pleased to say he's still alive. He has written a number of books on Lincoln specifically, on various kind of aspects of Lincoln's life, his speeches, his kind of personal writings and diaries and that sort of thing. He's also published works on Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and Ulysses S. Grant. So he's done kind of a whole slew of different things around the Civil War era. Now, this Lincoln biography, A. Lincoln, is, of course, most likely going to be his seminal work, the one he is most remembered for. And this book was a big deal when it came out in the sense that it was published in 2009, so the bicentennial 200th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birth. And I don't have a comprehensive list of Lincoln books in front of me. I'm certain there were many other books that were released that year as well. But if one of them has sort of stuck with the public consciousness, it is this one. It has been very highly reviewed to this day, again, much like the David Herbert Donald biography that I reviewed kind of the last time we did one of these videos. It has very much stayed in the popular consciousness, and you can still buy it very easily at any major retailer. And, you know, that praise has been both from the public and from Lincoln scholars as well. And going into this is actually the one true Lincoln biography, at least the Lincoln adult biography, if you don't count ones for kids back in the day. This is the one true biography that I read of him. I had read this years ago, and I was very curious to see kind of, you know, how it would age, especially now that I have a few more Lincoln biographies under my belt as part of this project. And overall, this book holds up very well compared to the other biographies. Now, I say it holds up very well. Am I going to go so far as to say I think this is the best of the bunch to this point? I don't know about that. This book is, the actual like proper text of this book is almost 700 pages in length. So very long book, and really doesn't feel its length. It's a very easy read. White is a very accessible writer, and that's not really any sort of issue at all. I think, if anything, the closest thing that I have to an issue with the White biography compared to even the David Herbert Donald one is that it doesn't feel its length a lot, to the point where it almost feels too short. And it almost feels like certain sections of the story are a little bit rushed, perhaps. And maybe not as delved into from a detail standpoint as maybe you were expecting. And I think this is more so geared towards the presidential years. I think the early years are actually probably better represented in this book than in any other. Apart from the like apocryphal Carl Sandburg stories, which, you know, the historical accuracy of that is debatable at best. I think this book does a really good job at balancing the, you know, the early years, the years when Lincoln was in Congress and starting to make a name for himself as a politician, up until you get to the 1860 election. I think actually, you know, a little over half the book is just on those years, which is a little bit unusual. Normally it's a little bit more kind of either evenly balanced or weighted in favor of the presidential years. And this book, I think, does a really good job at exploring kind of the minds of the, you know, Lincoln's rise to prominence, and not necessarily in just describing the actions, but also describing what made Lincoln stand out compared to everybody else. Now, the flip side to that, of course, is I think the presidential years, you know, it's hard to, like, I understand, like, trying to adjust the ratio a little bit here, but I think if you're going to cut down the amount of time you're spending on the presidential years, and I think they cut from most of the right places. Like, I don't think the actual Civil War battles and campaigns are described any more than they absolutely need to be, which I think is very effective and very fair. But I do think there are some events that are described in very drawn out detail in some of these other books. You know, Lincoln's interactions with McClellan, the loss of Willie Lincoln, right? The events of, like, after the 1864 election leading up to his assassination. His assassination is, like, you know, blasted through in like 3 pages or something like that. It's just major events that I'm used to writers taking a little bit more time to kind of sit with. And White doesn't really do that necessarily as much. At least that was my impression. So again, your mileage may vary. I feel like I could have used a bit more detail personally to at least really have this book say, yes, this is my number one. I think this is the best Lincoln biography I've read so far. Now, where this excels, I already talked about how there's a bigger focus on the earlier years. The main thing that this book does really well, and I think stands it apart from everything else that I've read so far, is how much attention it pays to his speeches. White takes a lot of time to sit with Lincoln as a speechwriter, as a public speaker, as a master of rhetoric and oratory, and really tries to explain the why behind that. So you have these kind of deep dives into the language he's using at various public events, at his inaugural addresses, inside of the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, of course. And, you know, White is really trying to understand kind of what makes these speeches tick. Why do we view these as these classic pieces of rhetoric? What were the strengths? What was Lincoln trying to bring out? What were the tricks that he was using? And I believe this is very directly based off of some of White's previous writings, so he's very much integrating that in here, and I think that works really spectacularly. And yeah, I think it sets it apart because in the other biographies, you have this, you know, mutual understanding that Lincoln is this master of rhetoric, and you talk about the events leading up to the speeches, you quote them at different points. But I think White taking the time to help you understand exactly what makes these special is really important. I think his explanation of the Gettysburg Address is one of the best that I've read personally. And I think even if you think you have read everything there is to know about the Gettysburg Address, I think it is worth just kind of sitting with those paragraphs, those pages in here, and letting it sit with you for a bit. So again, I think the writing here is really accessible, possibly the most accessible writing style out of all the Lincoln biographies that we've talked about so far, which is a major plus. I think the actual factual accuracy is probably another boon that this book has going for it over any of the others. You know, this came out almost 15 years later, after the David Herbert Donald book, that is. And I think Donald himself has even praised this book and saying that, you know, it benefits from those extra years of research, and in doing that makes it a more effective and more complete biography than his own. So very respectable comment. And yeah, I think it is really helpful in that way to get a little bit more of a contemporary read on that sort of thing. So, ultimately what we come down to is this is a really strong biography, and I think I would have no issue recommending it as your first Lincoln bio. And I think of the ones that I read, of the four proper ones, not counting Team of Rivals, I think this is a very, very clear second, and not really that far behind the David Herbert Donald for number one. Again, I think maybe even adding probably it wouldn't have been more than 25, 30, 40 pages more of detail for some of these other events that are more well described in other books. I think if you just take that time and expand again what is already basically a 700-page book into a 750-page book, at that point, you have a tome whether you like it or not. You might as well take the extra time to expand it a tiny bit. That's nitpicking. It's not a real criticism. But I think if it didn't have the extra detail in those pieces, I wouldn't have any hesitation saying it's the best one yet. As it is, I might lean towards the Donald one still, but this is still really strong. If you can pick it up for cheap, or if you just see it new at your Barnes & Noble, local independent bookstore, what have you, don't hesitate to pick it up. It's a really great resource, really worth your time. And yeah, Ronald White, A. Lincoln. Check it out. With that, I want to say thank you all so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.